Hey everyone, and welcome back to Embroidery Tutorials. We are stitching our way through my 90 variation chain stitch sampler, which you can find in my Etsy shop if you'd like to get a pattern and follow along with us here. Today is Detached Fly Stitch variations. Now, some people would consider fly stitch to be separate and outside of the world of chain stitch. I think it is basically the same thing. It's right inside the world. It's just that the feet of the stitch are separate instead of together. It's basically the only difference. So we're going to cover several stitches in this video. Hold on to your hats, but they are all very simple. And if you followed along with our first circle in this sampler where we talked about detached chain stitches like lazy daisies and all the variations on that, you will notice that most of these are almost exactly the same. Again, with that only difference being that the feet are separate instead of together. We are being very thorough here, so of course, I had to cover every single one of these separately because I wanted to. So here we go. We are going to be talking first about detached fly stitch and moving through some variations from there. This stitch is really easy. All you're gonna do is come up through the fabric at one side of your little half circle here, back down on the other side, and then before you pull that loop all the way tight, you're coming up at the midpoint of that loop. And then you're just gonna pull that extra slack tight and create that little tacking stitch on top by going down in almost the same location. Now, I do have a few notes about this stitch. You'll notice it often comes out looking more like a V than a U, and that can be helpful sometimes, but sometimes you want that U shape. That has to do with how tall your stitch is, how tightly you pull your thread, and often how thick your thread itself is. If you're using a thicker thread, you're going to find it's easier to keep that U shape rather than having the lines go taut and straight. But ultimately, a lot of it is about your height and how tight you're pulling it. So keep that middle stitch a little closer to where you started, where your two legs started, in order to get more of a shallow U or a bowl shape instead of a V. Or when you're pulling that slack up, just make sure you're not pulling very tightly. Pull it to where you want it to be and then tack it down. If you just yank that thread through and make it really tight, you're gonna end up with a V every single time. So pull gently, get that U shape to where you want it to be, and then tack it down and it'll stay there. Next up, we're gonna do some layered detached fly stitch. The names are just gonna keep getting longer. Stay tuned. So this is pretty easy. Again, you're doing the exact same thing. You're just stacking several of these on top of each other. So you could do as many of these as you wanted theoretically. I would only suggest doing 2 stitches on top of each other or 3 stitches on top of each other in this area. Otherwise, it'll just get too bulky and you won't really have room for it. So I'm gonna vary between 3 and 2 every other one so that you can see both. But to do this stitch, you just wanna think about the line that I've created for you being the outside of your stitch. So you want to start your first stitch much smaller. Don't make it too small or you won't see any gap in the center, but you want to go just a small bit inside where that loop is. Create your first stitch, tack it down, and then you can come out of the same points or just go slightly to the side of the legs of your first stitch to create that second one. And I like to come up about where my first tacking stitch went down. So wherever that one entered the fabric is where I'm going to come up to tack down the next stitch. And this makes sure that all of your layers are really close together and create a really nice pattern here. Of course, we couldn't move on without doing some interesting tacking options. So we're going to start out with that French knot to tack down our stitch. Who knows what you could use this for, but it's specific, it's special, it could have a place in the world. So we're gonna start by doing our regular fly stitch. You're gonna come up and then down on either sides of that semicircle, and then you're still coming up and going through the loop that you've created right at the top of that semicircle. But before you tack it down, we are just going to create a French knot, which means you're holding your needle horizontally and wrapping the tail of your thread, the part that's between the fabric and your needle, around the needle twice. You're always going over the needle and then under, so away from you, over the needle, and then towards you, under the needle. I think if you were to turn that so that the point of the needle was facing you, you'd actually be going counterclockwise. So do that 2 or 3 times and then insert the needle back into the fabric halfway, making sure that you pull that knot tightly around the needle before you bring the needle all the way through the fabric. That's the most important part of any French knot, is pulling that knot tight, because if you don't do that, you're going to end up with a bunch of loops and knots on top of the knot that is supposed to be there. It's not going to look good and you're going to have to take it apart. So once again, as we go to tack down that stitch, you're coming up through the fabric, through the loop that you've created, and then you're wrapping the thread around the needle twice is good, 3 times if you want, going back into the fabric over that loop to tack that loop down, tightening the thread around your needle so that we're making that knot right up against the fabric, and then bringing the needle all the way through. Pull slowly as you do this. If there's a knot that gets created because you're pulling really fast, you might never get that undone. So pull slowly for the best option of a really nice, beautiful French knot. And French knots aren't the only option, so we are going to look at a colonial knot to tack down a detached fly stitch. Again, you're starting out the exact same way, up on one side of your circle, down on the other, up again at the center, going through the loop that you've created. This time we're going to create a colonial knot before we tack down that loop. So in order to do that, you are sliding the needle underneath the thread that is between the fabric and the needle. And that seems like a weird thing to say, but hold the thread sort of up on an angle towards yourself and then put the needle under and through it. And it's better to see it in the video. Look at the video. It'll explain it much better than I can with words. You want to make sure that you have that V going over the needle. And then you're taking the tail of your thread, the part that's between your needle and the eye of your needle, and you're wrapping that around the tip of the needle, away from you and then towards you. And then just like with French knots, you're inserting the needle halfway into the fabric and then pulling that knot tight before you go all the way down. I don't typically have nearly as much trouble with colonial knots creating any sort of extra loops on top of the fabric like French knots will do a lot, but it still can happen if you're not pulling your knot tight before you go all the way through. So make sure that you pull that extra thread out of the way, get that knot nice and tight around the needle, and then slowly pull your thread all the way through the fabric. Now we're going to touch on a really easy one. This is a twisted detached fly stitch. Now for this one, I drew 3 dots for you for each one. So there's going to be 3 stitches on each side of our little central area here. And those 3 dots are simply because your final stitch is not going to be a half circle. So I didn't want to give you a half circle there and confuse anyone. So what you're doing is you're coming up at one of the lower dots, down on the other lower dot, and then back up on that 3rd dot in that sort of triangular shape. But before you go through the loop created on top of the fabric, you are flipping that loop over to create that twist in the legs. So if you watched the previous video where we talked about detached chain stitches, we did a twisted detached chain stitch, which looks a lot like this. And I did note in that video that you don't want to move the legs of your stitch too far apart, or you were turning it into a twisted detached fly stitch. So again, that's the crazy part about embroidery. All you have to do is move one of your stitches a couple millimeters over, and now you're technically doing a different stitch. So this is, in essence, the exact same thing as a detached twisted chain stitch. We have simply moved those legs further apart from each other to create an ever so slightly different look. Another easy one here, this is the detached fly stitch with long tails. Same exact thing as a regular detached fly stitch. You're creating that initial loop, and now instead of creating a tiny tacking stitch, you're gonna create a long tacking stitch. I know it's like rocket science, who would have thought? I promise the instructions will become more necessary as we move through these stitches. They do get a lot more complicated, but right now they're nice and easy. So you're creating that loop and then you're doing a nice long stitch to tack it down. And I have seen these stitches used, I think of it as upside down so that the tail is like a stem and the top is like a little flower. If you put a bunch of them together, you can make it look like a little dandelion head. There's a lot of things you can actually do with this one. So it may be extremely simple, but it's also pretty versatile. And the last of our detached fly stitch variations, we're gonna add Pistil Stitch right up here at the top. So again, you're creating your traditional half circle loop, and then before you tack down, you're gonna do a Pistil Stitch rather than just a regular stitch or a French knot. So you're starting with what looks like a French knot. You're wrapping the thread around your horizontal needle twice, 3 times, twice is usually good. And then you're inserting the needle halfway into the fabric, but not close to the loop like you did before. You're gonna go further away. So like you're doing that long tail stitch and a French knot. Combined, that makes a Pistil Stitch. So you're inserting the needle halfway through the fabric, a little ways from your original loop, tightening up that thread so that the knot forms around the needle, and then slowly pulling the needle all the way through. And for some reason, this one just makes me think of a tiny little alien. I don't know why, but it looks like a little alien head on top of 2 really long legs, and that's what you start doing when you've been stitching for a while. Every stitch starts looking like a really specific thing to you, and you kind of want to rename them. So I would call this the alien stitch. Well, you all, thank you so much for joining me again for this round of tutorials to look at all of these detached fly stitch variations. This was several stitches, but all pretty darn easy, so anyone can easily grab these and figure them out in just a few minutes and be a master of them by the end of the video. If you would like to continue sewing along with us, it's pretty easy to catch up at this point because we're only on circle 2. You can always go grab a pattern in my Etsy shop and join in, and we look forward to seeing you for the next tutorial video when we're going to be getting into non-detached fly stitch. What does it look like when it's all together? We will see you guys then. Thanks so much for watching.